Hey y'all, welcome to the Clock Tower. I'm Colton here with Brandon and Brayden, all three members of the Clock Tower here for this one. We're talking about every important deck going into the fall meta. We do this every year. We've done this a few times now. So how this is going to work? Same way it always does. We're going to go through every set that matters in alphabetical order. We're going to kind of take turns passing it off between the three of us, kind of leading that conversation. We're going to talk about what the decks do, if they're any good, and how to play into them if you see them across from you at regionals. We're going to start with last one of the best decks from one of the best sets from last meta and still very relevant going into the next one. Brayden, talk to us about Quince.
So Quince is looking very good into the upcoming meta. There are 4 viable lists. However, the 2 that are really threatening are the 8 salvage and 8 standbys. Both of them strongly positioned, depending on what the other decks in the meta and what like this ban list that everyone's expecting comes out. 8 standby has this really good back row support, pushes a lot of extra triggers, a lot of extra standby. So the standby doesn't push damage problem is not a factor here. And then 8 salvage just ignores its opponent and just pluses infinitely until it gets into its really nice big top end. If you find yourself against these decks, usually if you're fighting 8 salvage, walling up is usually pretty good. Things like Alice pose real big problems in the new slime. Against standby, they will break your walls, but they can bleed hand quite frequently. And then the one thing that Quince does not have is stock swap. If you stock compress very hard, they cannot deal damage to you.
Yeah, Quince is very scary, honestly. Both the 8 standby and 8 salvage builds. 8 salvage in particular just kind of does whatever it wants. It has almost perfect fixing, incredible plussing, really strong top end. It's probably the most solitaire thing that we're going to see in this meta. It really doesn't care that much what it's facing into, even if it has to crash its board. It's still just going to have incredible hand size because it has those back row pieces that let it, pump its hand to 8 or 9 cards. Really difficult to deal with. Your best bet is to force it to use enough of those cards so that it only gets 2 combo lanes instead of 3.
I do think that 8 salvage Quince is at this point the best generic 1k1 slam climax and go deck that we have seen come out of Weiss Schwarz.
Yeah, I think that's 100% accurate.
Having 2 meta contenders in the same set is going to be really interesting because that's going to help divvy up some of that representation from the set itself, dividing up between those 2 decks. But overall, I think we're going to see a lot of Quince this fall.
Mm-hmm. And just because the 8 salvage and 8 standby are there, I do recommend, we won't talk about it here, but take a look at 8 choice and 8 bar. They both have interesting engines. They're both solid decks still, but they're definitely less relevant.
Moving on to AOT, there are 3 different ways you can build AOT, none of which did particularly well in spring. The most successful list out of all of the AOT lists was the 8 salvage list. You're going to see the salvage level 1 more often than anything else. It top checks 4 and gets either the new mobility gear or a character. You'll also see the choice top end, which is essentially Icy Tail for level 0 characters instead of CXs. And the Sasha top end is pay to pitch to summons another character to the board. None of these top ends are super impressive. You still see some good cards, obviously. The Armin, for example, gives hexproof. Whatever's in front of it, the level 3 Armin. Overall, set's fine. Generic, decent 1k1. But the top ends just don't get there. The level 0 suite just isn't as powerful as it used to be. It's still got some good cards in it, like, it's got the center runner Armin that sits at 3-5, like the OG 3-5 center runner. So it's got some good cards in it for sure. but it is not as powerful as it used to be.
Yeah, that sums it up pretty well. I think all of Titan's viability relies entirely on the arm and back row in combination with the early play Aaron.
Yeah, no, especially with Hexproof being relatively relevant coming into this fall season as well. I think that's about the one thing that has really going for it. Looking at Arifureta, which is going to be coming out in November. So, going to be towards the end of the fall season. There are realistically two different builds that you might see from this as it comes out. There's the 8 salvage build, and then there's also this 2 soul, and probably with the bar top end. The 8 salvage build is very much a package in and of itself, really dependent on just try to play solitaire, but it's not going to be as helpful as some of the other ones. The level 1 combo being reveal top card of the deck and potentially add that to hand, and then blind stop at the top of the deck. So it's potential +2, +1 to hand, +1 to stock. The level 3 top end is actually an additional burn combo. The burn being discard a card, and you burn based off of the level of the card you discarded +1. So you can actually be very selective with your burns at the top if you're able to filter your hand effectively. So that's actually a pretty decent top end to be aware of come the fall season. The other one being the bar top end, which is relatively cheap, but it's a expensive restand essentially. So you're able to kind of build up that resources throughout the turn. So it's still on the cheaper side, but it's a restand combo. So playing into some of those things is at least something to be aware of in the fall. I don't think it's going to make much of a impact when it comes into play, but it has a lot of different tools in a lot of unique deck building opportunities there to be able to see something in the fall.
Yeah, the set is unique and it's got some fun stuff in it, but one, it comes out really late in the season, so you're honestly not going to see it unless you're playing something at a November event or December event. And even if you do, the set is only okay. It's one of those things that probably would have been a lot better 2 years ago because it would have had, that unique tech to potentially deal with matchups, some surprise stuff that could have gotten some of the meta stuff off guard. But in this meta, it's just way too underpowered.
It's relatively consistent. It has tools like, for example, an 8 salvage build, similar to the 8 salvage build of Quince, where it's able to actually search out its own climax. So being able to very well guarantee climaxes on the turns that it wants it are definitely tools that are definitely going to help with that. But I think it's going to be outclassed by the things that are currently in the meta.
Yeah, as far as I know from this, I know one of the builds that I've seen a lot of from Japan is the 2 soul build, which none of the other decks in the format exactly run 2 soul climaxes, especially post IMA ban.
Yeah.
So this having the actual 2 soul on the climax gives it some push in the early game. However, if we want Soul Rush, we have a few other decks in this list that will do that way better, way earlier.
Mm-hmm. Well, plus also that combo that pairs with that 2 soul gets its benefit off of the cancel versus actually the 2 soul going through. So you can push damage and run out of resources really quickly, or stick nothing and build up the resources for days. You're trying to somewhere balance in between. Next up is Avatar. Avatar: The Last Airbender, recently released and coming into that kind of competitive play here in the fall. Realistically, its more popular build is probably going to be that kind of 12 standby build, where you have the kind of the Zuko top end and you're trying to play standby to get to that point. The Zuko top end being able to essentially restand based off of damage canceled, so it's trying to guarantee its damage through. But it also really pairs with this Sokka level 0 to try to get additional attacks off at the top as well. It also has the back row assist that allows that Zuko to effectively choose its own trigger, so you can try to help push standbys to help push more attacks from the back row as well. So you can try to just stick as much damage as you can at the top. Outside of that, it's really just more of like a traditional standby deck, just trying to get to that level 3 end game. While some of that damage can be nice and helpful, I think you can outlast this combo with some decent compression.
Avatar's a weird set. It's got a couple of really interesting things going on. The standby package is I think, interesting. Like, it deals with board really effectively. It has really, cheap advantage on board. it doesn't have a burn, anything like that. And then probably the most interesting card is the Ang combo, in the 4-color deck that, if you mill 4 colors off of its mill effect, you get to do, multiple different effects. There are burns involved and, guaranteed damage, things like that. So it's interesting. I think that's easily the most interesting deck. And I do think I've said this before that someone is going to solve that deck and they are going to be scary when you sit across from them. But typically, as of right now, I don't really buy the Sokka engine yet as a way to push a lot of advantage. I think it still needs a lot of things to go right. So I am skeptical of Avatar's long-term viability going into this season.
I have played a few games against Avatar. The list that my opponents saw the most success with was actually the salvage into the Ozila standby, which I think will end up being the top end of choice instead of the Zuko top end, just because that one actually does push damage. It's an on attack, or it is an on reverse combo, but and it can abuse the Sokka quite effectively. But the big thing with Avatar is that you will see it just by popularity. Any of the lists, I feel like, have a chance of showing up anywhere.
No, absolutely. Like, there's also the 8-bar list as well that tries to do things that other decks can do a little bit more efficiently and effectively, where it has the top end of the Toph, where it either kind of realistically act like Alice in the mid game, comes on play kind of like Kanata, but also has the pay 2, burn 2, very similar to kind of like what the Marine would do. So it's trying to be all of these things all in one combo, all the way there, but it's just very expensive to get on board. It's difficult to get the resources necessary to get these things on board, and then have the resources to turn around and do all of the things you want to do.
Yeah, looking at the Toph engine, specifically level 3 part, even though the deck is like, because all the packages are wrapped up into just Toph, like you would expect it to be able to like sort of get around its selection problem and be able to like more consistently get multiples. But every game that I fought against 8-bar Toph, they were only able to ever resolve one Toph. And all of these decks on this list have a way to out that.
Oh, yeah.
And if you lose that Toph, you actually negged on this one. Toph does not plus the first turn on board, unlike Kanata, because Kanata can salvage 2. You can completely refund like the Kanata cost in addition with the heal. If you can manage to keep Toph on board for a turn cycle, yeah, it's probably way better. But I think it's just too fragile.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, next on the list is Azure Lane. This is a massive set. However, most of the lists that we're seeing out of Japan and a lot of the stuff people are looking forward to, very green heavy, mostly focused around this level 0 Brainstorm Climax combo. Basically, this is just a stock charging combo that it bounces to hand when you slam the bar, and then you put a character from Waiting Room into stock, and then it's on a check 3 self-tap Brainstorm. So it just slams a whole bunch of stock, generates a whole lot of compression out of that, tries to get through its deck with a lot of deck speed, and then tries to play any one of its multiple finishers. 8-bar, I know, has been a popular choice. Bar salvage, quite a few things. What this deck, I think, has that every other deck on this list is still sort of lacking is this level 0 rush play with this vanilla bonder and vanilla package, where they can slam 2 of this bonder in the back row, get 2 vanilla 3Ks from their deck, and these vanillas sit at like 5 or higher with like 3 soul each, and they will slam you for 4/4/4 going second.
Yeah, that's definitely the strength for Azure Lane. You were talking about, stuff that is more effective at damage push if that's something you're trying to play into. Here you go. This is the set that's going to do that probably more effectively than anything else. It doesn't drop till the end of October. So again, if you're not playing in a November, December event, this you don't have to worry about it. Ultimately, its meta viability is, whatever. It's it will win games because it's pushing damage and damage wins games, but it's not necessarily a top tier meta threat, although it can upset just about anything in the meta. So, not exactly something I'd be thrilled to set out across from, but something I also wouldn't expect to necessarily make it all the way to top tables consistently.
Also, quick notes: this deck does have stock swap plus 1 card Fumio, plus like if you're familiar with like the old Alice top ends that the ones that milled a whole bunch of cards and then burned for the number of like triggers or climaxes. This does a very similar thing for 8 bar. So it does have a consistent top end to top off that big push in the early game. But this deck, I feel like its wins are going to be so first deck reliant.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Next up is Bang Dream, my baby. So Bang Dream has a lot of different stuff that it still can do. Having 6 or so sets will let you do a lot of different things. Most of the builds currently are going to be very anniversary focused still, 5th anniversary focused, leading up into the Kasumi at the top. It just works the best. It lets you run red for buns for luck, the easiest. The cheap finisher, anti-burn, cross turn is really strong. And the rest of the list is just getting there. The common lists that we're seeing are 8 salvage, 2 different 8 salvage lists. One with the old Christmas and this very heavy event package, and the other one is the new 8 salvage from the pre-con, the structure deck, with the on reverse ditch 1 search 2 combo. I do think that the on reverse combo is stronger just because of the selection, the compression, things it lets you do. However, until we see something like an Alice hit, I think that the event package will still remain the most prominent version of this deck.
Yeah, and there are a million ways to play Bang Dream, right? I mean, we talked about it in our spring recap. I think it was 12 or 13 different Bang Dream lists all managed to top. So when someone opens Bang Dream, you don't necessarily know what they're going to play. So when you play into Bang Dream, wait until you get a really good sign of what they're playing before you commit necessarily to a line. The thing with the Kasumi, I think the Kasumi is great, and I think the Kasumi is still relevant. Because it's uniquely positioned to play into a lot of the stuff that's good in the meta right now. A lot of damage intensive heavy top ends, things like Gura that swing for big numbers. The Kasumi is uniquely positioned because it has both neg soul and anti-auto access. So in order to play around Bang Dream, you need to hold up your blinks or hold up your bouncers so that they don't have lanes to play the the neg soul backup and also lose the anti-auto damage. But if you don't have blink, which some sets aren't running it, some decks don't have access to it, you could be in trouble against Bang Dream because Bang Dream wants to extend into a 2-turn endgame, and Kasumi can do that even against some of the very best decks in the meta. So definitely worth paying attention to. If you have access to blink, if you have access to a bounce, make sure you hold that up going into level 3 against Bang Dream, or else you might just not stick any damage.
If you find yourself sitting against Bang Dream, I think the biggest thing to always look out for is buns for luck, is that stock swap. Nobody is ready for stock swap at 2. That's how I won basically all of my games at Springfest, was just slamming stock swap at 2 and swinging for 2-2-3, 3-3-2. Just nobody is ready for that to happen.
Yeah, which kind of requires you to play a little more stock light. You are not building as much stock as you normally would. You have to be more willing to spend that stock on early play healers and things like that. Because as soon as you start developing 5, 6, 7 stock, you're going to have climaxes that are buried the rest of the way, and you still have half the game to play.
All right. So next on the list is Data Live. Data Live's in a really weird spot. everyone still, I feel like, is a little like coming off the set 1 data life thing if you've been playing for 2 years now, 3 years. Kermie is still a real finisher, and she will hurt you, even at 2 copies. However, getting there can be a little bit of a struggle. Sort of in the same vein as Quint, you have these, like, your back row support gives you this really nice big back row pump when you rip standbys and rip triggers and everything. However, you don't have all the tools that 8 standby Quint has. And then you also don't have, like, the walling capacity that MTI has. So you're stuck in some weird limbo in between where you have this really nutty finisher you play that's limited to 2, and you have this average standby 8 standby engine going in behind it.
Yeah. It's still trying to almost like relive the glory days without having access to all the tools that made it into those time periods.
You'll see the choice mid game quite a bit. You'll see, I mean, there are like a lot of ways to play Dal, but the best decks are still probably trying to get into the Kasumi. But
Kermie.
in any case, there's not enough there for Dal to really push in a contemporary meta. It only had the 8 standby list only had 4 tops during the Springfest season. Choice Pants and 8 Choice both had 3 as well. So, you know, it's fine, it's playable, but especially now with the new stuff that's coming out in the fall, it's just going to push it even further into kind of that mediocrity spot.
Mm-hmm. Dal just sort of lost its niche, and now it's struggling to find a new one.
Danmachi has not changed. It's the same deck it was. It's the same deck it always will be. 4 salvage, 4 pants. Plays a lot of events. It gets massive at level 1, which gives it an opportunity to actually contest some of these bigger boards. It can deal with standby boards. It can even contest an Alice board, which is pretty impressive for a free level 1 combo. It can get nice and big to at least force counter. The biggest issue for Danmachi is its top end. Its top end isn't very good. It's just a cancel burn that you can assign at pump soul to the thing you assign the cancel burn to. If you're compressed, you don't die from 3-0 to Danmachi. That's its biggest weakness. If it had a real top end, I think that this could really contest, if only because it can actually win board on offense. But other than that, it doesn't really have anything it's really, really good at. It has good mill, so it has, you know, some natural compression it can get out of bad deck states, but it just doesn't do enough at the top to be super relevant.
Yeah, this is just another one of those. It's another 1K1 deck that tries to run as cleanly as possible. But if you want a clean 1K1 deck, we've already discussed like 2 other ones that are better than this in Quince and Bangdring. Alright, speaking of running clean 1K1 decks, Grisaya, a little bit different than the other ones because this is a memory compression deck. Not as much as like Saikano and Slime, but it will still get there. There is one list for Grisaya. It is Salvage Pants. There is no other option. I have played the other options, and they do not do what this list does. Basically, it's going to loop its level 1 combo. It's going to keep going, keep slamming Salvage, keep generating anti-heal, and then it's going to try and 2-turn you at the top end with a stock heal, burn 1, or stock swap. Unfortunately, Grisaya even just does not have the top end finishers, even worse than like Danmachi. The finisher, I think, is the absolute worst part of this. It's nice that it's stock heals, but again, so does Hestia. Hestia is free. I have to pay 1 to stock swap or burn 1. But the big thing keeping Grisaya relevant is going to be 2 things: anti-heal and a 2-soul level 1 bomb. These are the reasons you play Grisaya. You slam 2-soul level 1, you push 3/3/3, and then you say your opponent can't heal unless they discard their whole hand. And then you hope you survive a turn off a mild amount of memory compression. Unfortunately, I don't think it's well positioned, even with, if we were to see like an Alice hit, I think Versailles is still just not well positioned enough to like see real play, just because too many other things bully it in a shorter game. I think the game's too fast for Versailles.
Yeah, in a 2023 competitive environment, you have to be able to push more damage. Like a 2-turn end game is just not viable anymore unless you have some kind of defensive setup the way that Bang Dream does. It's just not there. The stock swap on combo is pretty nice, but it would need to at least be able to stock swap and burn to be relevant. And the fact that you have to choose one or the other, like it's Trouble Girl, and Trouble Girl is just not good enough in 2023.
It's literally worse than Trouble Girl. I have to pay a stock on attack to Trouble Girl.
Yeah, no, I agree.
So looking at HoloLive, one of the most popular sets in English, one of the most played sets in English. A lot of ways you could play it last season. Primarily, it was Kanata Marine. Usually, it was something into the Marine top end. You had Coronet, OKU, Sora. Pretty much everything played into the Marine top end, unless you're playing just the 8-bar Sora list. This year's going to be a little different. Gura has dropped. We're going to have the Gura in play. It's a pay 2, pitch 1, burn 2, and then mill 1 twice. And for each soul trigger, burn 1. So you're really looking at, especially with all the soul triggers on the deck, a single lane of Gura is going to swing for 4-2-1, including its swing. Just an insane amount of damage that Gura can do, which means that Gura has supplanted everything as the deck of choice in HoloLive, and it's immediately going to become one of the top decks in the meta, if only because 3 Guras can win the game 2-0, and it's not even that hard. It's also got a lot of extra stuff. It has great fixing, CX assurance, stock swap, all on the right colors. You're typically going to see the Gura with the level 0 Oz-Key standby combo as a way to try to cheat out a free Gura at level 2 and a free Ame at level 1, because you have an Ame that when it attacks, you can accelerate and give it on reverse blind stock 2. So you just get all of these extra resources so that you can slam as many Guras to the board as you can, try to get that triple off if possible. Marine was cheap and consistent, but had a limited ceiling. Gura is not very cheap, but there are ways to get around her cost for a much, much higher ceiling. You'll sometimes see it with the choice level 1 as well, kind of more like an English HoloLive tribal kind of build with the Kali level 1, but I think more often you're going to see it with the standby to try to get the free advantage off of the Stamators.
Technically, you could also probably see it with Kanata too, although I think the Oski is going to be the more popular build.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, Ozkira will be the most popular build by far. And then there's also just all these other HoloLive lists that you'll probably just see. See HoloX, you'll probably still see Kanata-Gura. I mean, not Kanata-Gura, Kanata-Marine. It'll probably still exist. Some bar lists still. Sora is still a very floodgatey card. If you don't have an out for Sora, it will ruin your day.
Yep.
But you just gotta look at see what your opponent mulligans and just hope you know the HoloLive card pool enough to have your answers.
Kaguya. With Kaguya having the new set, we saw a little bit of that in the spring season. We saw it actually begin to pick up quite a bit, even after Alice dropped, with a slightly different take on Kaguya, especially that salvage choice build, where you're able to kind of do the brainstorm combo to get additional stock to try to help you play into some of your tech more efficiently. So you can try to play into the Alice combo, trying to remove Alice a little bit more efficiently while still being able to benefit off of a combo from the back row. Leaning into the choice top end, trying to play into those additional burns, tying in with the 2-1 event that can basically grant the kind of Musashi on play of the event, so that way you can give the characters with the burns additional burns on top of them. So just trying to get all that explosive power at the top to try to close out your opponents. There are other ways you can play this as well, both with the old combo of the salvage top end of the burn ones, or with the new pants top end as well, trying to get all of those events into memory to get those burns. But I think that we're probably going to see that salvage choice combo the most, as it has some of that more explosive top end possibilities with the opportunities to play into some of those techs to try to play into different matchups more efficiently.
Yeah, Salvage Choice was the most popular Kaguya list in top 8, 7 tops in BSF. Deck's all right. The top end is fun. I think the Chica is really good. It's got some fun tech pieces, but its mid game is only okay. It's not amazing. I think it really just kind of falls into the bucket of this is a pretty good 1K1, but in this upcoming meta against a lot of other, more powerful stuff where the metas are really taking a step up since the spring, I just don't think it has the gas to keep up.
Yeah, Kaguya, I think it's been the most adaptable deck that we've seen from like the Dow era and like some of the earlier Bang Dream stuff. Definitely had like the biggest change considering it was only 2 sets of support. Yeah, I think we're starting to see a shift here, and I think Kaguya is like the best example of burn ones aren't exactly cutting it into a lot of these other decks. They're not closing consistently enough.
So moving on, Dragon Maid had a pretty solid spring, considering that basically nobody played it. I think as a set, Dragon Maid had probably one of the best conversion rates based on just the lack of play it saw. If people had played Dragon Maid the way that they played Danmachi, I think we'd be talking about Dragon Maid very differently. But as it is, a lot of people thought it was dead on arrival, so didn't pick it up, didn't play it, and it didn't get a lot of representation. But it did turn that representation into 4 tops at BSF and 4th place in Rumble. I think Dragon Maid is not in as good of a position as it was in the spring. In the spring, it had answers to a lot of the stuff that was present. You had the level 2 killer that could just deal with Alice, the level 2 memory kick that could just take care of any large thing that came down. It swung extremely high power. The level 1 combo is extremely loopable, very easy to get the bar back into hand and, use the bar filter to go get combo again, use the back row Kanan to keep combo on board and just keep looping level 1 combo and then playing whatever tech was necessary alongside it to mitigate your opponent's board advantage. And the Ilulu top end is just good. I mean, swinging for, 4 over and over again with some burn ones thrown in and an icy tail as well in your off lane is just a really good way to consistently close from 3-0 or beyond. So I still think the deck is good. I think the biggest issue with it now is that more of the stuff that's coming out is less interactive. If anything, the issue for Dragon Maid is that more decks are like Dragon Maid, where their game plan is to loop their combo, try to plus as much as they can in the mid game, and then just spend all those resources at level 3 to try to burn out an opponent. And that is the strategy that Dragon Maid interacts with the least because it's not board based. It's not trying to, prevent on board plussing. It's just get your resources and go. So Dragon Maid is kind of the same archetype as a lot of those other decks that are going to be really good this fall. 8 Salvage Quince in particular. I think they're basically the same deck. Just 8 Salvage Quince. All of the power lines are better. All of the effects are upgraded. The rest of the meta has outpaced what it is able to deal with. And there's so much less interaction on the board now than there used to be, which is what Dragon Maid's strength used to be, was dealing with what opponents were presenting and being able to respond to it. A lot of the new stuff, a lot of the new powerful stuff, Hololive quintuplets, there's just no way to interact with or respond to it. And that's going to keep Dragon Maid kind of on the outside looking in.
Yeah, and I feel like that was the biggest flaw of Dragon in general. It has all the tools, just granted, there's always a 50 card problem where you only have 50 slots to fit all this tech that you really want in Dragon Maid. But I think the biggest issue fundamentally with Dragon Maid was the fact that it was a response deck, always playing in response to what your opponent did, especially after your first level 1 turn.
Mm-hmm.
Where all these other decks are very proactive. Quince in particular, knows what it wants to do every turn of the in every situation. Dragon Maid, I feel like you have to know what your opponent wants to do, and then you grab the appropriate response for that.
Playing Dragon Maid well requires you to know what all of the best decks in the meta do and how to stop them. And not just at the table, but while you're putting the deck list together. You need to sleeve up all of the answers to all of these different things. And it was possible to do that, which is why the deck did have success when it got played. But I don't think that there are good answers that can be printed to the consistency of 8 salvage or the sheer damage potential of Hololive. Like, there's nothing any set can do about that. So in a tech heavy deck where your goal is to try to have responses, there's just no counterplay available for Dragon Maid, as much as it pains me to say it, because I still think the deck is good.
Looking at Mushoku Tensei, still under the most previous ban with the choice restriction between the tap counter and then the 2/2 that can grant full field power. This puts it in a very interesting spot because all of a sudden now it has to choose between the big wall or the defensive tool. And the big wall not being quite big enough to really like challenge the current big wall champion to such a degree that it would actually be very beneficial to it. It has to make that choice really early on how it's going to play this game. 8 standby is still going to be that most typical build you're going to see up till Alice. Really, I think seeing the 2/2 was the more likely scenario as the option for the deck. But after Alice, I'm suspecting you're going to see a lot more of the tap counter with it and try to play more of that traditional standby route as opposed to trying to make your level 1s overly massive, just because level 1s that are overly massive can usually get sidestepped by other pieces as well. With the amount of soul being pushed, especially with Hololive, with slamming the salvage every turn with Quince, worst case scenario, you can side against those and then prevent some of that damage coming back on the backswing, right? Playing into the idea that standby doesn't push soul. And so I think Mushoku Tensei falls behind a little bit in that regard if it's playing with the 2/2. But if it's playing with the tap counter, it's trying to slow down the opponent's top ends, which it may have a little bit more success with, but it needs to be able to build up those resources to play the expensive tap counter, which it's going to struggle with considerably as it's not going to be winning board as often. So it's in a rough spot at the moment.
Yeah, I think that MTI is in very much a very similar boat to DAO, where it has to choose between two of its very big playmaking pieces, effectively, the 2/2 and the tap counter. I think the difference between this and DAO is that because the restriction is still lighter than the DAO list, you still can like execute game plans very smoothly.
Yeah.
And yeah, I do think it comes down to though the lack of damage that the standby pushes out. Even with all the twin drive, your soul trigger count in this deck is weirdly just not as high as these new decks still, which is a point of contention for power creep in the game. But I do think that MTI and standby in general will struggle very soon with the next list that we're talking about. But if we see the full set of Japanese hits come over to English, including the ban on the Alice Brainstorm and Overlord hit, I have seen MTI pop up and become way more popular in Japan recently because it is still now once again the biggest standby deck. It also got freed.
So being freed, being removing of the pieces that are kind of like the bigger pieces in white in the play right now, it kind of becomes the big man on campus regards to standby boards.
Yeah, especially at those level 1 turns. You would still lose to raw played Alice as well as the up and coming slime. But yeah, winning board early like that really does affect the game, especially if you can start putting out level 2 early. All right, so we mentioned it, but Next up is Overlord. Definitely the boogeyman coming into the format here. I think even more so than Alice to some extent. If we do not see hits, I believe that we will be in a weird triangle format where Overlord beats Alice, Alice beats Slime, Slime beats Overlord. All three decks have this nice little whole bunch of niche plays that they can all make in that direction. Specifically for Alice, they can shuffle back and then deny the bounce back if Alice goes to level 1 first. They can deny the level 0 plus, which means that, and then they can also deny the whole Shalltier on reverse combo. However, once Alice gets its board blown up, if it pushes Overlord to 2 first, which Overlord will go to 2 first, Overlord just blows that deck up every turn, and then you just can't do anything. That's what Overlord does. For Slime, we'll mention Slime later, but having double hexproof in the back row completely shuts off your board getting blown up by Ions, and then you just outcompress and out-resource. In all of this, Overlord is like the big point of contention. Obviously, Big Bone Daddy coming out early at 2, shoving all 5 events under him, blowing up a whole field. There are some plays that you can do around Overlord. Specifically, the play to do is you hold anti-change counter. Specifically, if you have level 1 anti-change counter, your deck is way better positioned to fight Overlord than anything else. Or if you can be at level 2 and hold level 2 anti-change, that also functions. However, Overlord will most likely hit first, because that's the only way you can actually remove Ein from the board is anti-change counter in their attack step.
Yep.
A good Overlord player will side attack your lanes to prevent that from happening. Even at 2, they will side all 3 lanes at 2. So if you have these big level 2 boards, you can reduce a lot of soul damage that turn, but you still have to deal with your board getting blown up the following turn. There really isn't another answer for Ein, unfortunately, that we'll be seeing. There is like some very specific ones, like the Suisse and Hololive has its own specific out, as well as the Hachima in Hololive. These other like mutual board nukes. So there are a few answers. Actual generic hexproof does get around, so funny enough, Attack on Titan is weirdly well positioned into that. It doesn't stop burns that the events provide at the end of the turn. It does not stop the draws that the Vampire Bride package offers either. In general, how you want to fight against Eins is if you can wall up past their level 1 combo, which I think swings in at 8-5 and then they can run pumps.
8-5 is if they get reverses. If they can get 1 reverse, they can pump up that 7k up to an 8-5.
They only need 1 or 2 lanes. 1 lane of plussing is probably enough for the Overlord player to go off. But yeah, it's a really rough matchup for most other decks. This is one of those floodgate matchups that will lock a lot of other decks out of the format.
But yeah, it's definitely a gatekeep deck for sure.
Funny enough, one of the answers to this is Soul Rush. If you can push damage really fast, faster than they can stabilize their Eins board, Eins does heal. Well, it heals for each Eins every time they slam a climax. So they can heal 3 times a turn if they keep doing the effects. If you can push them faster than they can push you to, like, because you die if they end their turn and you're at 3-3. They will go for game. So you just have to finish way faster than they can, in my opinion. Definitely a thing to look out for.
Yeah, this is definitely going to be a deck that's going to be challenging to face off against, especially a high-level Overlord player. I think it does take a lot of skill in playing this deck, because there's a lot of moving pieces with this deck. So it may be challenging to play as a player, but it's also going to be challenging to play against as well.
If we do see the ban list, I doubt they'll hit it immediately.
Yeah.
But if we do see it, 8 Standby, I think, becomes the deck for this set.
Mm-hmm.
Very nice, very similar to the Kasumi, and that has anti-auto damage. And then the 2/2 being a frontal like 15 assist that changes into that anti-auto feels really good. Pretty strong 8 standby list coming out for Albedo 8 standby.
Yeah, it is. I was actually impressed with how smooth that deck felt playing that deck.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, there's no way anything else is going to be able to step out of this coming out of Overlord. And then the bar combo definitely proved its worth.
Review Starlight getting its second and third sets this year in quick succession. Unfortunately, neither of them are really all that good. There are lots of different ways to play this set, but none of them particularly powerful. There is the cut-in finisher that has either Mocha 3 or Burn 2, and it pairs with a Hikari that allows it to be spawned onto the board. So you can get 4 swings, including potentially 2 Mochas or 2 Burns or some combination of those. That's pretty okay. I think that's probably the finisher that you're going to see the most of. There's also the pants that we talked about on 5 cards, 5 minutes, the Icy Tail that doubles on reverse. So you can mill through 8 cards, potentially Icy Tail for multiple instances of burn damage. The one I like the most is the Claudine and Maya, where you can fix the top 3 cards of your deck so there's a soul trigger on the 3rd card, and you can set up multiple burns that way. I think that's the most interesting one, but again, none of them are super great. They have some reach, but not a ton of consistency. Mid game's okay. You have a standby combo you can play that, searches 2, but you can only do it once. There's also the pants combo. It's just a regular old Maguro, top check 4, add 1. There's some good tech pieces in here as well. But overall, the set, pretty underwhelming. It doesn't have a high ceiling at any level, I don't think. Like, it's got a good early play healer. It's got a stock swap. Like, it's got all the stuff, but it doesn't do anything spectacular enough to really get it close to the top of the meta. It's the kind of deck that probably would have been okay if it came out when it came out in JP. Probably would have been in line with the competitive meta a couple years ago, but it's, pretty clearly outclassed as this new meta dawns. The stuff that we have out now for Relive on its own is basically not playable at all. None of this is going to be even remotely usable until mid-October, because the movie set, which comes out September 29th, is where most of the good cards for this set originate. So, not even really worth thinking about until mid-October, and even then, it's fun. It's a fun deck to play. The IP is great. I'm going to buy it, but it's not worth taking to a high-level event because it just doesn't have enough gas.
Yeah, this deck is unfortunately probably the most dated on this list, if not like between this and RWBY, that and maybe Versailles as well. But the IP looks great. Out of all the decks on this list, this is the one where you're most likely to sit down and your opponent's going to have a max rarity version of it. It's the best part about some of these Weiss tournaments, is seeing everyone else's bling.
That's fair. That is fair. Looking at RWBY, RWBY is kind of on its way out, realistically. Probably the most successful build from RWBY has been that choice with the split standby top, playing into that choice combo that allows it to stack all of its combos onto one character, so it can try to guarantee one reverse to get all of its benefit off of that combo turn. Combine that with the dual standby potential top ends. Technically, you have the Pura that can come down at 2 and do its combo at 2 to shovel back. Just try to decompress your opponent, and then you have the RWBY top end that allows you to essentially do its clock kick burns to try to just close out the game on those turns. So it is a deck that has a lot of interesting tools, a deck that has some decompression tools and has some explosive moments, but it's going to struggle pretty heavily trying to get some of those things off, especially with a lot of the new items that have come out. It's going to have some pretty intense struggles, especially when it's trying to play into that kind of standby package a little bit more. Decks like Overlord are going to be able to clean house and force it to spend the little resources that it does have in ways it necessarily doesn't want to, forcing things to be more expensive, forcing it to not have enough resources as the game continues on.
The game has gotten faster,
Yep.
both in the early game and the late game, approximately one turn on each side. I think this deck actually struggles a lot with the game getting faster in the early game.
Yes.
I think this deck always struggled with these big finishers just because of how RWBY herself works. Very similar to like the Konosuba package and everything. It's fast enough by itself and it's disruptive enough, but I think this deck loses in the early game. Even though this set has some of the best zero lineups that we've seen in a long time, I just don't think it's enough for like have all these strong utility profiles. I think you need to be pushing damage at zero now.
Yeah, and because it's not in a prime position to be able to do that, yeah, it's gonna struggle significantly here. Looking at Sword Art. Sword Art is basically Alice X, right? It's Alice playing into your choice of top end. Alice being the level 1, sitting at basically 11k, 12k with Climax, being able to stock charge and get cards into hand, so it's able to sit big, get your defensive counters into play, so it's able to essentially try to loop that combo. The more often you can loop that, the more you're just going to snowball into that victory. You're trying to win early, is really what you're trying to do with this deck. You have a lot of mill tools to be able to mill down, so that way you can try to guarantee your Alice is on board. You can speed through your deck early to make that happen, so that way you're in next deck, you're ready to go. You can also time it out typically pretty efficiently to make it so you also refresh pretty thin. So all of a sudden your next deck is also pretty well compressed going in as well. You have a variety of top ends that will see play. There's the Silica build that they'll pair with the Graham event to try to avoid any kind of counterplay and just try to go for that additional small burn, cheap burn, so that way they can tri-field and go with that kind of combo. There's the Kirito build, which plays a little bit more into kind of that neg soul kind of idea, a little bit more into a little more versatility at the top.
It's an extra soul trigger as well, which really helps in the list.
It does play a little bit into memory compression, a tiny bit, because you have the UGO you can put into memory as well with that list. It just has a bunch of different pieces, parts that really play nice into it. It also has the pants trigger to be able to try to get that choice back into hand to loop that Alice a little bit more efficiently as well. There's the Argo, which is a little more explosive, but requires a lot of resources and is really good as like a snowball effect. So if you're able to snowball off of Alice early, Argo is going to be your closing engine, close out from pretty extreme range, like 2-4. And there's also then the Mother's Rosario as well, trying to go with a little more consistency, a little bit more of that looping with the bar combo. So you get the bar into hand, switch it into the choice and go. This also benefits on you being a little bit more compressed, as it deals damage based off of climaxes in deck. So it's just another way of playing the game. I think you're more likely going to see that Silica or Kirito build more than the other two as season comes on, but definitely things to be aware of as they have access to the different counters, access to money counter, access to anti-change, and that they can back up to like 14k starting as early as 1.
Yeah, if your level 1 on reverse combo does not reach 14-5, you're not winning against Alice.
And I think that's pretty well a gatekeeping deck in itself. Like, this is like the gatekeep deck of this upcoming meta. I think is like, this is what everybody's preparing against.
Yep, this was the boogeyman of the last format. It will remain strong. It's one of those things where it's like we have one of two paths depending on what Bushiroad decides to do in regards to restrictions. If Alice lives on, we continue to see the same thing we saw all of spring season. We see Alice into X finisher, most likely to be Silica, in my opinion, just as the most consistent option and lets you play the most other good things at the top. If Alice is hit, we have actually seen a significant drop of all of Argo, of Silica, and of Kirito. And the one that has actually taken its place has been more Mother's Rosario. just because it fits so well with the generic 1K1 style that you have to play when Alice is hit.
Well, you can also play into the level 1 combo with that too, right?
Exactly. You get a double combo, and you can still run the 2-1 Alice as another combo.
Because it can be on bar, it's also much more readily available to make that triple kind of combo happen.
Yeah, also that Mother's Rosario finisher is definitely, I think, one of the more potent ones, closer to Argo in terms of like what it can do to your deck, especially in multiples. The biggest problem being the in multiples part, being in pay 3, pitch 2 up front. Definitely a very steep cost paying. If we do see the Alice hit, I think the deck is still amazing, just being sword art. But I think that we'll see a rise in lots of Mother's Rosario stuff, and most likely we'll probably see some Neg Soul lists as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's definitely some of the things we're going to see. The question will be whether or not we'll get a mid-season ban on this.
That will determine a lot of what happens with sword art.
Only because they just announced the most recent hit to the ban list, removing of the Excalibur that shouldn't have been there, and then the adding of the IMA. I tend to think we're probably not going to see a ban list until after the season, but we saw that kind of almost emergency ban list in the beginning of spring after 2 events, so...
Yeah, and it's like, I'm still questioning how Bushiroad is running their ban list stuff. We know, based off the statement they gave for the IMA list, that this seems like a decision that they had to sit there and think about for a minute before actually hitting IMA, which is an egregious interaction that shouldn't exist with is how Bushiroad designs this game. The fact that they did this hit so separately makes me think that this was more of the emergency hit that they had, and that we might actually see a real ban list going into the season. Definitely before Worlds, we'll see some hits.
Yeah, I'm very much on the same board that we'll see a hit before Worlds, but yeah, I agree. I also agree that was definitely, it read like, no, this is an emergency ban list that came from on high as opposed from the actual office itself with the IMA.
Yeah, in the meantime, expect to see Alice. The same answers that you had in Springfest for Alice, you can expect to use and see a lot more of those in all of these lists. Alice is still, in my opinion, unbanned Alice is the number 1 deck in the format. You will see a lot of it, and it will top a lot.
7 Deadly Sins. What a year it's been. Came out to much, I don't know if I want to say applause, but it came out to much attention, at least, in the first month of the year. Went to Worlds, did well there, finished 3rd and 4th. Got restricted, did okay in Springfest, and then kind of as the season went along, kind of started to fall off in popularity. Ended up 3rd overall in terms of number of tops, including 6 wins. So the deck is still good. It's, Escanor is going to try to burn 1 6 times. The challenge is now that you don't get to play the Gil Thunder, you don't get to fix the top of your deck perfectly, you don't get to do that in addition to a bounce. So it's harder to put Escanor in a position where it's going to get 6 burn 1s. It's far more likely to be burning for 4 or 5 now than it was before. You still have the top check 2 and the bounce effects, but they're on different cards. So it forces Escanor, which doesn't have a great fixing engine, to fix for an additional card. Usually people will play this with either the level 2 combo or the level 0 combo, both of which have CXs with 2 soul triggers. So trying to put the 2 triggers in the spot for the Escanor is a lot more difficult now. That and Alice came out right at the same time. And I think that most people who were playing heavily into Escanor kind of jumped ship and went to Alice because it was just a better deck. Escanor's still good, but I really think it's about to fall off precipitously this fall because I don't think that its mid-game has anywhere near enough fixing or consistency to stack up with all of the really powerful stuff that just came out.
Yeah, I think Escanor is going to receive the biggest hit. Well, not get hit, but the biggest hit when we start seeing these very big blowout finishers come out. because this was the deck that people already knew that they had to try and kill from 2-5. So now when you have these decks like Gura, Quince, Overlord, the big three, Slime even, they're not going to let you get to level 3 unless they know they have something up like Tap Counter or something where you're not ready for it. These decks will attempt to kill you from 2-5 and deny Escanor as much as physically possible. More so than what all the other decks were already trying to do.
Yeah.
All right, next up, Psychono. The one of, I would say, 2.5 memory decks that we have in the format. We're really only seeing one list of Psychono being the bar into salvage top end with the change train. Gives you quite a bit of memory compression and quite a bit of selection. The biggest issue running this, especially into, as we just mentioned a little while ago, Alice, is that the Obero combo needs to survive its own turn on board in order to plus itself. This was a problem back when in JP when it was Psychono Dal Grisaya meta, where Psychono was forced to side attack the Data Live 2/2s to prevent Dal's advantage as well as getting its own pluses. Dal was the superior deck in that format just because the damage mitigation extended the game far too long for Psychono to catch up at that point. We'll probably see a similar thing here, except the problem will be most likely worse because a lot of these other decks in the format are just faster than what Psychono can do.
Yeah.
All of these memory effects require stock, and even with the really, really fun Gaming All Night event, you do not have the stock generation in this deck in order to facilitate that unless you manage to somehow find a way to extend the game an extra like 1 to 2 turns.
That's the issue that Psychono is going to be running into. Is just it's not going to be able to build up the compression that it needs to build in those cancels to build that natural compression through memory. It's going to struggle a little bit, I think, too, with trying to get the pieces that it needs in that mid game as well, especially because of, like you mentioned, the Obero combo needing to just trying to survive to be able to help generate some of the advantage that way. Like, mid games are able to get set up really quickly, more quickly than before, and I think that's going to be a big struggle too.
Yeah, because they are playing Obero on bars and salvages, you find a very similar problem to a deck that I brought to Springfest, which was Choice Salvage Bang Dream, which also did not run like a traditional plussing level 1 combo. When your plus is like the card that's itself, you have to rely on other methods to generate, to get your selection for your finishers, for your early plays, for your tech. That was a problem that I was running into in Bang Dream. I was like struggling to tri-field my finisher most games just because I would lose a finisher and I didn't have a way to like pay it out and recover the resource. So I feel like that will be a very similar problem for Psychono. Luckily, they do have the change chain, which solves so many problems. However, similar to Grisaya, which is the other deck from this era, your finisher is a 2-turn finisher, and that does not cut it unless you have some way to really like milk that extra turn out, sort of like how Kasumi can.
Yeah, Psychono's just kind of missing the pieces it needs to fight into a contemporary meta deck. It doesn't have stock swap. It doesn't push enough damage, like you said. Its mid game is okay, but again, not a lot of great fixing there. It's just not a modern deck. And it just can't really hold serve against this stuff that pluses way more than it does, selects way better than it does, and finishes way better than it does.
Yeah, the only reason Quince gets away with not having stock swap is because their set is ridiculous. They have nutty finishers like Eat Ski and gross board advantage with by. They don't need stock swap to as an out.
Speaking of things you need stock swap for, Tokyo Revengers. Almost always played in the a traditional like dual laners Pachin kind of way, either one or the other or both. Ended up with 21 tops with one or both of those packages. The idea being that you use the dual laners, you only swing twice, but you generate extra stock off of the effect. And Pachin comes down, sits at 16k, something ridiculous, can't be touched, really. So you plus on board, you've got a mountain of stock, and then you just use that to pop off one of Tokyo Revenger's very expensive finishers. The deck is still viable. I don't think it's going to have as easy of a time into these things that speed up the game, especially like Hololive just doesn't really care. It's going to swing for a lot of damage and try to push the game as quickly as it can. If you can get the Pachin down before the Ames, then all of a sudden Hololive's going to have a hard time getting to its stock. So like there are definitely still ways in which Tokyo Revengers is good. It can handle the Alice matchup, at least to an extent. But if you can stock swap it before level 3, all of a sudden all of that stock compression is just gone. So if you have access to pre-level 3 stock swap, you definitely want it in this matchup. Even if you have access to level 3 stock swap, you probably want it in this matchup. It like will help you immensely. That's the key piece if you have to play into this. But yeah, it changes the game into something that feels very much like not Weiss. And if you're not ready for it, if you haven't tested into this, it's going to get you. It's a hard thing to play into if you're not prepared for it.
Mm-hmm. This is one of the biggest reasons why you play a memory kit counter as your backup. This deck is the reason why you have that.
Absolutely. Yeah, being able to get the Pachin down, even with Alice, trying to get that down before Alice gets on board, is also has like a huge benefit to it too, because then you can try to deny the Alice benefits coming in as well. So like if you can try to wall out against Alice and try to be essentially the one in control of the board at that point. Last up, we have Slime. Slime has a new deck. Slime has a new set that had just come out, so we have some of the new things with that as well. We still see the old Shizu level 1 combo, still standing the test of time, in part because memory compression is still fantastic and free memory compression is even better. That kind of leads into the new 2-1 combo, very similar to that kind of Alice style where it is plussing one card to hand and one card to stock. It searches instead of salvages, and then stock charges from waiting room. What makes this really relevant is also this back row support piece that allows it to, combination with the Brainstorm, sit at 12-5 on your field with hexproof across the board. You do need a second copy of that support to get full field hexproof to deny Eins, being able to remove all of your pieces from the board itself. But then it pumps up your front row to 13. So you actually have like a pretty massive board, able to use that. It's on pants as well to be able to help generate additional resources on consecutive turns. It doesn't play as heavily into memory compression as you have in the past with Slime, and you notice that the combos here are level 1 and level 2, in part because our level 3 is combo-less. We have an experience condition of having all 3 colors of the deck in your level. It's an on-play heal and then a pay 1, pitch 1 to burn equal to the level of card revealed off the top of the deck plus 1. It does have a variety of access to different counters as well. So kind of trying to play more of that defensive game. It sets a little bit bigger than Alice at 2. So Alice has to be able to contest that in some way. It does try to take away from that a little bit. Extra turn later than Alice, so it's kind of playing into that board and has to get bigger than 14, which is a little tough to do by itself. So definitely a lot to work through with that deck. It still has a really good matchup in the current meta.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that 2-1 combo is really interesting into the stuff in the meta that's currently good, right? Because sitting at 12-5, it can defend against an Alice, it can defend against the Quince 2-2, it can defend against an Ame, right? It's big enough, and it comes down at the right time to actually, have that size advantage, and that matters in this spot. You force the other player to either play way into their power stuff or into some kind of removal to deal with that board. On the other side, the price you pay for that, despite, it's an excellent plussing combo at 2, it's kind of that in between Alice and Kanata kind of thing. Very effective, very efficient, but you don't get to play an actual top end. And I don't know if that Benimaru is going to get there. That it doesn't push a lot of damage. It's fine, but you're also kind of blind swinging, hoping you get good burns. You don't really have any control over what you're swinging for. Slime is still, it's got all this good plussing stuff. It's going to have, its cards, and it's going to be able to get to this top end. But in 2023, again, I don't know if this top end here is going to be enough to push enough damage, especially if you need to close from anywhere outside of 3-0, which is, kind of the status quo for a lot of these decks now, is that the best decks will close from 2-5 or 2-6 pretty consistently. This finisher, I don't think can do that consistently.
So I've seen quite a bit of this deck because with the Alice hit, this is the Alice effectively on the Japanese side, and I do think that this 2-1 combo is actually just stupid. It's nutty, cracked, whatever you want to call it. Because you are Slime, you get the privilege of having the best deck compression in the game. And then having this 2-1 combo just exacerbates that problem for your opponent. I think that realistically, dropping Shizu for 1 turn cycle is just as effective at preventing damage as dropping the Bang Dream finisher. If not, if not better sometimes. I've seen this deck's gross, it's disgusting. If Alice didn't come out at level 1, I think this beats Alice.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that this does have a little bit of edge in the Overlord matchup. I've sort of alluded to it with the other decks, but I think that my top 3 decks going into this format, if nothing is hit, is Alice at number 1, and then Slime and Overlord vying for that number 2 slot. If Alice is hit, I think that Slime actually moves up to number 1 and Overlord is number 2. I think that Benimaru is actually just good enough to get 2 turns as a 2-turn finisher, just because you are Slime.
I think it's really going to come down to, is the compression going to be enough, especially with the number of decks that have access or tools to try to decompress your opponent or burn through your opponent's compression. I think it's really going to come down to, can Slime get 2 turns?
Mm-hmm. It's I've seen. So luckily we don't have Nay from Puzzle and Dragon. That finisher is a little ridiculous, but I do think that I have seen Gura kill people from 2-1, 2-0. I've seen Nay kill people from 2-0. I think that I've seen Slime stop both of these finishers from 3-0 and just live through all of it. I think it's if you were annoyed at what Slime could do beforehand, it gets a lot worse if you're relying on just raw burning finishing power. I'm not going to say it's going to work every time. You will still get Gurrid from 2-5, and you will sit there and look at your deck and see 3 climaxes in a row on the bottom. But
yep,
I think that your compression is good enough, at least a majority of the time, to survive some of these ridiculous finishers.
So that's it. Thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully you found that useful. We'll have 5 cards, 5 minutes on Thursday, a deck tech next week, and gameplay for that deck the following Thursday. Until next time, thank you so much for joining us. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe, and have a good one.
we'll see you then.
See you.